So in today's video, we're going to be discussing Shinji Mikami's thoughts on a possible Dino Crisis remake that someone asked him at Gamescom 2024. Now, for those of you that don't know, Shinji Mikami is the creator of Dino Crisis and Resident Evil. So let's go over what he said about a possible remake. So Eurogamer essentially approached Shinji at Gamescom 2024 since Shinji was actually working on Shadows of the Dam remaster, and they essentially asked him what his thoughts are on revisiting a Dino Crisis remake or getting another Dino Crisis game. On top of this, Eurogamer also asked him about the recent Capcom surveys that have been going around and how basically Capcom fans definitely want Dino Crisis to come back, which to be honest is a phenomenal question to ask Shinji Mikami. Now, Mikami actually was kind of surprised with this, with this question. He was actually surprised that fans wanted to see a new Dino Crisis or a remake of Dino Crisis. So what Mikami essentially stated, and I quote, he states, "I'm very surprised to hear that," said Mikami in relations to fans wanting more Dino Crisis. And then after he goes on to say, so even if I were to decide to make a remake of or a new version of Dino Crisis, I don't really feel like there's a whole lot of space for that kind of game right now, just since Monster Hunter has become such a big game. But yeah, it is surprising. Now, the first thing that I actually want to go over here is the fact that I think it's a bit strange that Shinji is kind of, comparing Monster Hunter with Dino Crisis. So his essential argument here is that he says, well, even if I were to work on a new Dino Crisis game or, a remake of the game, it doesn't seem like it's going to do really well since everyone already has Monster Hunter. I don't think that's a good argument since Monster Hunter is completely different than Dino Crisis. Now, for those of you that don't know what Dino Crisis is, it's essentially like if you guys could imagine Resident Evil but with dinosaurs. Like that's the literal game. It plays the exact same, it has the same fixed camera angles. So I find it very strange that he's comparing that to like an action like RPG or whatever, or like adventure kind of a game with Monster Hunter. Now, personally, I've played Monster Hunter. I tried to get into it since my Japanese friend back in high school was super into it, and he was like, dude, you should play it. I couldn't get into it, honestly. It was just not my type of game. I have heard a lot of Monster Hunter fans that have stated on YouTube that it's a hard series to get into. Maybe that was just the older games. Maybe the newer games are a lot easier to get into. I mean, I have looked at a lot of new footage for the new Monster Hunter Wilds game, and it does look pretty awesome, but it's not my type of game. And also, it's not the type of game that's very similar to something like Dino Crisis or even Resident Evil. As we already established, Dino Crisis is essentially the same thing as Resident Evil. There's no puzzles in Monster Hunter that I'm aware of. There's no RPG mechanics in Dino Crisis. The only RPG mechanic that I could actually just think of from the top of my head is just like upgrades to your guns that you can actually find in the game, or you can actually just upgrade it. Like in Dino Crisis 2, they added like not a merchant, but like a store that you can essentially buy new weapons. And in the first one, you could just find upgrades for your handgun. Also, I don't understand why he's kind of saying that Monster Hunter is the same thing as dinosaurs from Dino Crisis. Like, Monster Hunter has some like wild animals. Yeah, they do have some dinosaurs, or they have versions of dinosaurs, but it's not just dinosaurs, right, to my knowledge. The other thing that I also have an issue with is the fact that he said, but yeah, it is surprising. He says that it is surprising that fans, they want more Dino Crisis. I don't really understand why he'd be surprised of that. Obviously, Resident Evil has been doing a fantastic job, and as mentioned, Resident Evil is super similar to Dino Crisis. So, if Resident Evil is doing really well, a lot of fans would want the same thing for Dino Crisis. So I'm a little surprised that he's surprised that people want more Dino Crisis. Anyways, then Eurogamer actually asked him and told them about the whole situation that happened with Exoprimal. If you guys remember, when Exoprimal got announced, there was a chick that looked very similar to Regina, and everyone was like, oh, it's a new Dino Crisis, it's a new one. And then after, it's like, nah, that wasn't the case. And then after, Mikami essentially stated that the concept is pretty different from that of Dino Crisis, said Mikami when compared to the games. I guess the fans got their expectations up, but here we are. Now, the one thing that I find very strange here is that he just a couple of seconds ago in this interview, right, this quick interview that Eurogamer did with him, is that he essentially said that there's no point in making another Dino Crisis because we already have Monster Hunter, even though they're completely different. So he makes that comparison, but then after he kind of contradicts himself here in the way that he basically says that the concept of Exoprimal and Dino Crisis is completely different. Well, it's like, well, then how are you comparing Monster Hunter with Dino Crisis? I'm so confused. Like, bro, what? what? So that's essentially where Eurogamer actually finishes their article. But what's weird is that if we look at the time extension, we actually get a bit more of the interview. So with this article, it essentially says that speaking to Eurogamer's Ed Nightingale and his friend and Shadows of the Damned collaborator Goichi Suda, better known as Suda51 at the event, Mikami told the pair that once I make a game, I really don't want to do it over again. So there's nothing I'd like to remake out of the games I made myself, but there's a game called Sweet Home that was actually made by somebody else. Since it wasn't something that I made myself, I'd be really interested in doing a remake of that. But as far as stuff that I made myself, I don't want to bother revisiting it again. No, that's actually a very fair point that I can actually sympathize with, especially when it comes to gaming. It's a very creative outlet. Sometimes you don't want to do something again that you've already worked on years ago. And what's funny is that Shinji's already kind of done this with the remake of Resident Evil 1, right? The remake that released for the GameCube. Resident Evil Remake, and then obviously later on we got the HD remaster. But as mentioned, I still find it strange that Shinji essentially shot down the potential of working on a future Dino Crisis game because he just thinks that we already have a Monster Hunter, and then Exoprimals is really different, but Monster Hunter is the same as Dino Crisis. So that doesn't really make much sense. But I mean, that's fair if he doesn't really want to work on past projects that he was working on. Maybe he just wants to do something completely new. And then for those of you that don't know, Sweet Home, the game that he actually wants to remake, this was actually one of the inspirations, the huge inspirations for Resident Evil. But anyways, going back to the article, what's interesting here is that it basically states that Sweet Home, in case you've never heard of the story before, was directed by Tokuro Fujiwara, Mikami's mentor at Capcom and the eventual producer on Resident Evil. Now that's something that I had no idea about. Now it basically continues on by saying it saw players take control of a group's characters, each equipped with their own unique abilities, as they explored an old mansion filled with supernatural monsters in search of the previous frescoes within. Later on, it ended up being hugely influential on the early development of Resident Evil, with the PS1 title initially being conceived as a remake of Sweet Home. So that's something, as mentioned, that I had no idea, that the director of Sweet Home was essentially like a mentor for Shinji Mikami, Tokuro Fujiwara. I had no idea about that. So that's super interesting. Obviously, I did know that Resident Evil was essentially supposed to be like a remake of Sweet Home at first, like in the early concept, but obviously they couldn't get the licensing, so Shinji just made his own story. Later on, it says, in March 2022 interview with Bokeh Game Studio, Mikami said the following about the impact Sweet Home had on him as a creator. Now, this is actually something that I do know. We did cover that interview that he did with the Silent Hill creator. This was back, 2 years ago. So my channel was just basically starting. Yeah, click this video if you guys want to see that. But anyways, let's continue on. It essentially says, obviously, there are a few things currently preventing Mikami from pursuing a direct remake of Sweet Home, with the main obstacle being licensing. To properly remake the project, he'd need the permission from the rights holders of the film and Capcom itself, which could be tricky as he is now working elsewhere at his own company called Kamui Inc. Another thing that I find very interesting is that reading another article by Kotaku, you actually get a different perspective of that same interview. So I'm assuming that all of the journalists were all in the same location, the same press kind of lineup, because Kotaku actually gives us a different insight on the article. They actually state that Eurogamer asked them, they actually said that Shinji actually stated, so even if I were to decide to make a remake or create a new version of Dino Crisis, I don't really feel there's a whole lot of space for that kind of game right now, just since Monster Hunter has become such a big game. But yeah, it is surprising. So yeah, just a different kind of addition to what was already spoken in Eurogamer. But it's interesting that there's so many different parts that Eurogamer kind of just decided not to post in their article. As mentioned, I had to go and look at time extension to get the rest of it, how he wanted to essentially work on Sweet Home. It seems very interesting that he kind of wants to go back to make survival horror games. I'm pretty sure I read in a previous article, I think like roughly around a year ago, that he didn't really want to do another horror style game. He did want to kind of venture out and do a different style of game. So it's interesting that he still has, that place in his heart for him to remake Sweet Home. So it just kind of begs the question, does this affect Capcom, in terms of them making a Dino Crisis remake? No. It's worth noting that, Shinji, as mentioned, he hasn't worked for Capcom since 2005. He had no say in, the Resident Evil remakes that happened, though it is worth mentioning that he actually did really enjoy the RE4 remake. So, is this going to affect Dino Crisis remake happening? No, I don't think so. As I've mentioned several times on the channel, I definitely think that Capcom is going to be making a Dino Crisis remake, just because they've done the Capcom survey and fans have already spoken out. Fans already want Dino Crisis to happen again, and the fact that Shinji doesn't understand that and he thinks that Monster Hunter is there for all the Dino Crisis fans makes no sense. As mentioned, I'm not a fan of Monster Hunter. I'm a fan of Dino Crisis and also Resident Evil because they're really similar, because they're made by the same dude, right, that worked on both of them. Not to mention, Capcom recently did their whole announcement of Dead Rising Deluxe Remaster that's actually releasing next month. So do I think that Dino Crisis Remake is a possibility? I definitely think so. Now, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure to click this one right here if you guys want to look over at the previous Dino Crisis video that I made, and consider subscribing if you guys want more Dino Crisis news. Anyways, thank you so much for watching.